In this video, you're going to learn a bit more about debugging your JavaScript applications. So debugging is the art of getting bugs out of your code, and these bugs typically come up from small typos. Code isn't working as expected, you expect some sort of variable to equal one value, but it actually seems to equal something else. So what do? You dive into your code and try to figure out where you went wrong. Let's say, for example, that we're not getting the correct list of to-dos. We're getting some information that doesn't seem right. So what do? We probably head over to render to-dos and try to figure out at what point in the code do our values start to go bad. So I might start things off by using console.log to print out the to-dos array. Let's see if the data that comes in is even correct. If at least that's correct, we can assume that there's something wrong with the function. If the data that's coming in isn't even correct, then maybe there's a problem with whatever code calls that function. So if we save things and we run the file, over in the console we can view the data and determine whether or not it is right. Now let's say that this data looks fine, so it must be something else. We might go back over into the browser and figure out what else we want to dissect. Maybe I'll take a look at filters. So what do? I have to change that log. I have to go over to filters. Then over here, I can see that data and determine whether or not it's correct. Using console.log to debug does indeed work, but there is a better way. This is using the debugger statement. The debugger statement is going to make it so much easier to figure out exactly what's going wrong in your code. We put a debugger statement anywhere in our application where we want to pause the code and figure out what variable values equal. So let's say this is the spot where we feel like something's going wrong. Instead of using a bunch of console.logs and constantly switching back and forth, all we need to do is type debugger. Debugger is going to trigger the debugging tools in our browser, and this is supported by all major browsers, not just Firefox. Now we go ahead and we actually save the file, and when the browser restarts, we can see that we're getting something that looks similar but also slightly different from what we might expect. The first thing I want to note is that the page is still loading and we do not have our items rendered. That is because the browser has stopped the JavaScript execution at this point in time before we render the data. So now what we can do is explore our program at this point in time. We can take a look at all of the various variables and their values. We have an image of the code up above, not an image, excuse me. We have the actual text file. And we can also switch between various text files to see what makes up our application. Now what's really interesting is that if we hit the escape key, this toggles the console from the console tab, and we can actually run statements down below using the data up above. So let's say that I'm doing the exact same debugging I did before. I use to-dos to print out to-dos, and there is my data. Maybe I see the data looks fine, so I move on to the next thing, which could be filters. I'm able to easily switch between all of the data and explore exactly what all those variables equal at this point in time. I could even look at filtered to-dos and see that that is indeed something that's either right or wrong, depending on what issue I'm trying to solve. So now we're doing this debugging and the program is not executing any further. So if we do want to continue on with execution, all we do is we click this little play button right here. That's going to continue on executing through the file, and what do? We get our data rendering. Now debugging is great with the debugger because we can pause our code, take our time, and try to figure out where things are going wrong. There's no limit to using one debugger. I could add another one down below, for example. So right here, let's add a second one. I'm going to save the file, and this is going to refresh things. So over here, we have stopped at our first debugger. So in this case, we don't have access to incomplete to-dos. If I try to access it, incomplete to-dos, it throws an error. We don't have access to that variable. It has yet to be defined. If, however, I click that play button, we move on to our next debugger, just maybe 10 lines below. And if I run the exact same thing, accessing incomplete to-dos, this time I do have that in place. So we can use debuggers throughout our program to really figure out where things are going wrong. Now it's important to note that these debuggers are only going to pause the application if the dev tools are open. If I close the dev tools and refresh the page, what's going to happen is we're going to execute through the app exactly as you might expect. We're only going to stop at those breakpoints when the dev tools are actually active. Right here, we can see the browser did refresh and it didn't pause at the debugger since the dev tools aren't open. Let's go ahead and crack those open again. I'm going to open up the web console, and now we're going to wrap this video up with a challenge. I want you to use the debugger to explore some data in the application. Right here, I'm going to remove the two debuggers that we already set up, and you're going to be using a new debugger inside of this function, inside of the filter callback function. Now remember, this function is going to fire multiple times. It's going to fire one time for each to do, so you're actually going to have multiple debug breakpoints when you run the actual application in the browser. So go ahead and add a debugger right here, and then for each breakpoint, explore the to-do data. Print the to-do text and the to-do's completed value to the DevTools console. Take some time to knock all of this out, then come back and click play, and we'll move through it together. All right, that was an easy one, just to give you a little experience using the DevTools and the debugger. Right here, I wanted you to add the debugger into the mix. I'm then going to save the file, and then over in the browser, it was your job to explore the to-do data for each to-do. So here we're at our very first breakpoint, the first time we are firing the filter callback function. Down below in the console, which can be toggled with escape, I'm going to access it using to-do. I can see the text and I can see the completed property. I could also use to-do.text if I wanted to access that specific property value. Now, if we click play, we're not going to go to the end of the program, even though we only have one debugger, because this function gets executed multiple times. So I click play, and we're back at the exact same breakpoint, although it's a different function execution. And this time around, we no longer have thing 1. If I use the up arrow key to cycle through our previous commands twice to just to do, we can see we are now on thing 2. Right here, we have the data for thing 2 showing up. Now we only have 2 to-dos, and this is our second breakpoint, so if I clicked play, I'd expect to run through to the end of the program. And that's exactly what happens. We're now at the end, and we can see that all of our data is showing up. Down below, I am getting a little warning in the console. This is coming from a browser extension that I installed, so you don't have to worry about that. You're not going to see the same thing. This is specifically from that extension. It is not coming from anything related to our application code. So there we have it. Using the debugger, we can pause our program at a specific point in time to analyze the variables at that point in time. This is going to make it a lot easier and more accessible to debug our applications and get them back to a working state. Now, as always, I am in the Q&A with my team to answer every single question that comes our way, but I challenge you to try to use these tools to debug your code on your own. Debugging is one of those things that starts off as super challenging and a huge time waster, but the only way to get better at debugging is to actually do it. So the more code you fix, the better you get at fixing code. Not only will you be better, you'll also be faster. So an error that once took you 10 minutes to track down now takes you quite literally just 5 or 6 seconds. So do work on building up that experience. It is not time wasted, it is time invested, and arguably one of the most valuable skill sets in programming. That's where we're going to stop for this one. We can now use the debugger going forward. We're going to continue on working on our applications in the next one.